Hello there folks, Mr. K here, the mediocre painter, and I've been painting miniatures for some 30 odd years, and I'm doing videos to help you get into the wargaming hobby because I've made the mistakes so you don't have to. So in this video today I'm going to be talking about dry brushing. Now if you've been watching any of my other videos, you may think I perhaps have a low opinion of dry brushing, and you would be right. So I never really thought I would end up doing a video about dry brushing, but I was encouraged to do so by a couple of friends because they thought I knew enough about this to impart my knowledge on others. So what is dry brushing? So dry brushing is a technique that you use to highlight raised areas on your miniature by having almost dried paint on your brush. So essentially you put paint on your brush, you brush most of it off so it's kind of somewhat dry, and then you pass that backwards and forwards across the miniature to highlight raised areas. And it's a technique that you can learn as a beginner very quickly, and when you are a beginner you can get quite excited by this technique and probably apply it to all your miniatures, as I did, as you can see here. My 10-year-old self painting a Terminator got a little bit excited and used white to highlight the model. What can I say? I was young and stupid, and back then we didn't have the likes of YouTube to share knowledge about how to actually do anything. The only way you could learn how to actually paint well was really to work in a wargaming store or just trial and error. So dry brushing, I think, is a very overused technique when you're a beginner, because you do get, quite decent results, and it's like, oh look, I can highlight. It has a tendency to be overused, and really there's only a few circumstances where it's actually going to produce quality results. So skeletons are a really good example where dry brushing can produce absolutely excellent results. So generally with skeletons, you'll use a base coat like a bone, you'll wash, and then you'll use a dry brush in a bone and maybe a lighter highlight, perhaps a little white here and there, and you can produce excellent results. Here's an example, a sepulchral guard that I did using exactly that technique, and that's sort of the classic way you do skeletons. Similarly, you can get similar results with models where they're majoritarily covered in chainmail. So fantasy dwarves are really good for that technique as well. You base coat in a black and then you highlight in a silver, and you get a lovely effect on the chainmail. The other two instances where it is very handy is in the case of Iron Skull here, and where you have fur or a fur coat, and also in the case of my chosen axe here, where we're talking about the hair. And I'm going to go into those examples in more detail, as well as a sort of an overall example about the kind of effect that you can get. So that the first thing you really need to consider when you're going about dry brushing is looking at that miniature and going, am I going to use dry brushing or aren't I? Because if we look at Iron Skull here, you can see that his pauldron is probably, where the fur is probably the only thing you're going to dry brush on this miniature. So you really need to do that early on in the miniature painting process, because one of the problems with dry brushing is it's indiscriminate. It will go all over your mini because you're brushing backwards and forwards with that brush, and it will go into other areas that you don't want it to. No matter how good you are, that will happen. So you really need to think ahead of time, what areas am I going to dry brush? Kind of easy when you're just going to do the whole miniature, right? You don't have to really think about it. But when you're looking at fur or hair and you're thinking, oh, actually dry brushing will be a good technique to use there, then that's the decision you need to make early on. I would not encourage you to use dry brushing for like highlighting a face, or perhaps doing skin or arms, that kind of thing, simply because it gives kind of like a sketchy effect on smoother areas and things, and it doesn't look all that great, to be perfectly honest. So it is something you really need to consider before you begin. So if we have a look at our iron skull here, then basically we've base coated the fur in a grey, and we're going to highlight in a light grey. And basically I'm shaking up my paint bottle here, and I'm getting ready to basically do a dry brush in the light grey. Now, you don't need to absolutely coat your dry brush that you're going to use in the grey. You know, it's not necessary to actually absolutely cover it, as some other dry brushing videos out there do suggest. You don't need to do that really, and it'll just be a hassle when you come to clean the brush. So once you've got that paint on the brush and you've evened it out on your dry palette, then basically you want to brush it backwards and forwards on something like a piece of foam. A piece of foam is really good to use, and then you can just test it on your hand just to see what kind of coverage you get. And you're looking to try and get an even feel of paint moving across with the brush, and so that you don't get streaks. That's what you're looking for. And then basically you're going to go in one direction continuously surrounding, you know, the actual miniature. Now when you're actually doing dry brushing, you want to use a cheap brush because it is fairly brutal on the actual brush, and flat brushes are often better, and curved flat brushes are often better still, because the curved brush basically doesn't let the paint gather at the ends. But in this particular case, because it's more three-dimensional, I'm using a sort of classic larger number 3 round-headed brush. It's a cheap brush. To do it, it's because a flat brush is really better when you're actually going vertically or horizontally on something, rather than a sort of three-dimensional shape or form. It's a little better, and you have a little bit more control if you use basically a rounded up brush. And you can see there that we have highlighted up in that light grey across the fur, and that's actually a pretty decent effect. And certainly that's not something you could come across by basically painstakingly sitting there and manually highlighting it. Now, in order to add a bit of extra depth, what we really want to do after that light grey is to basically give it a white coat as well. But in between, we really need to be cleaning our brush. Now, because dry brushing is a little bit harder on your brush, because effectively the brush is holding, in the end, dry paint, then you really need to wash it and probably use your fingers to basically push clean the paint off the actual brush. And what you may actually find is that on the darker pigmented colours, and I'll show this later, that you may actually damage, well, not damage the brush, but certainly permanently colour the brush, because the paint has actually dried on there and has managed to colour the actual fibres of the brush. So let's move on. We're going to do this white highlight now. So it's the same principle all over again. It's nothing spectacular. We basically take some paint, white paint, put a little bit on our brush, tap it out onto our wet palette, onto our dry palette rather, spread it out a bit to get a lot of the paint off. You can see there that we've taken most of that paint off, and then we're going to use our piece of foam to basically get it to the consistency that we would like, and check that there's no real streaks, and then just do a quick check on our hand to see whether we're actually getting something that we actually think is desirable. Looks like we're getting a reasonable coverage of white there. And now we're just going to do the same thing again, but across the mini with that white, and you can see that basically it's making it pop a little further out. But this time around we're just going to do it with a lighter touch, so that it still gives you the depth of the prior dry brush that you actually did. So that's that, and here's the finished results. You can see that it's pretty nice the way it's come out, and you're going to be pretty pleased with yourself on that. It certainly looks like fur, and there's no real efficient way you could do that by doing manual highlighting. What about doing an overall mini though? What about, say, this hellhound, for example? So I've undercoated this hellhound in a black, and I'm basically going to use a dry brush in a red to cover him. And it's the same principle as before, though because this is a bit more of a case of it's a overall mini and it's kind of a straight surface, I'm going to move in one direction across this miniature, and there a flatter brush at an angle is actually our best choice to use. So I'm using an angular brush here rather than the round-headed brush that I used when I was doing the pauldron. And the main reason for that really is I get a better coverage on this kind of model when I'm using this flat angle brush. Now when you're using like a light colour on a dark colour like this, you will find that you may need to do quite a lot of dry brushing in order to get it to really work out how you want. And also you may find actually that you sort of have to have the paint a little bit more wet in order for it to really work out for you. And you can see here that I've just used a light covering there, and you can see it's not really made an awful lot of progress on that actual miniature there. You can see that it's very, very light effect indeed, and it's maybe perhaps not what I'm really after. But if you persevere and you basically judge your dry brushing a little better, you can apply a little bit more paint to the dry brush and just build it up and build it up, and then eventually you'll end up with something that looks half decent like this, whereby I basically covered the entire mini using that technique with a dry brush. And you can see the effect really isn't that bad, and as a beginner you'll be fairly pleased. That's giving you a decent starting point. I'm afraid I need to put a bit of green stuff on the old head there on that particular miniature, but I'll get around to that next time. Now the thing is, if you're doing an overall covering of a miniature like that, chances are your brush is taken quite a pounding, and then you basically have to give it a jolly good clean. And what you'll find is with the darker colours, and with the longer you do the dry brush, you'll find it actually a little bit harder to clean. So here's an old dry brush I had, and basically it's kind of a bit battered, but you can see that it's kind of got a reddy colour to it because of the red that I just used, and it doesn't clean out too well because the paint actually dried. So what about another situation whereby we might actually want to highlight a light colour on, well, not so much a light colour, sorry, a thin colour on another colour. So a classic example is wanting to do like a yellow highlight on hair on something like a troll slayer or a fire slayer that is a base coat, say an orange or a red. So you can have a go at using your yellow to do the undercoat, to do the dry brush, and you'll find that it won't really take. So here's basically me having a go at doing this, and basically same job as before. You wipe out the paint, make sure you've got a consistent run on it, and then check it on your hand, and then start having a go on the actual hair with it. And what you'll find is because something like a yellow is a very thin paint to begin with, you'll find that the model won't really pick it up, and it'll be a little bit of a frustrating experience. However, there is a solution to that. So if you want to do that kind of thing, then what you're best doing first is to do a dry brush in a white. So if you do a dry brush in a white, like this, then you'll pick out the spots using a paint with a high pigment, and you'll get basically all the areas highlighted how you want in a white colour. Once you've got that, you can then use a light colour like a yellow on top of it, and it'll properly cover the areas that are highlighted. So here's basically the final example of that. We basically do a yellow over the white, and we end up with reasonably good results, even though, you know, yellow as a paint in most cases, like a sunburst yellow or a sun yellow from Formula P3 for example, is quite a thin paint. And if you ever want to frustrate yourself as a miniature painter, then, you know, try and paint, you know, a Bad Moon Orc with the yellow, because you need several coats and layers in order to really get a nice looking yellow on your actual miniature. But you can see here that using that white first really does help to bring out the yellow when you actually go over it again. And this is the sort of a better look at it, a bit more of a close-up look at it. So that's it. So that's basically, you know, how you dry brush. It's a relatively easy technique, but there are some things that you need to remember. You know, really think about whether you do need to use it or not. And then once you've decided that you will, do those areas first. Brush choice is quite important. You know, use an old brush, cheap brushes. Flat brushes are great when you have relatively flat surfaces to go across in one direction or another, either horizontally or vertically. And angled flat brushes will give you a little bit more control. And you'll see people recommending also curved headed brushes as well, flat curved headed brushes, because the paint then doesn't move to the edges and give you streaks. But to be honest, if you get the paint right off the brush and check it before you use it, you really don't need to worry about that. So that's not so important, to be perfectly honest. You don't want to use a huge massive brush either. You know, I see videos out there where they're using really enormous brushes. You know, it needs to be in keeping, you know, with the miniature environment. Don't use an absolutely massive brush, because it'll just go everywhere, and then you'll have, you know, a more difficult brush to clean. And you don't need absolutely cakes and cakes of paint on the brush either in order to be able to get a good effect. And if anything, you don't want to cake it, because it just makes the brush more difficult to actually clean when you're actually done. And do remember, you know, give your brushes a good clean between the different colours that you're using. Even though they may be cheap brushes, you know, nobody wants to be replacing their brushes every 5 minutes. Layering, dry brushing is also a good idea as well. It's another good tip, just in the same way that you would do layered highlights. It works the same way. So those are kind of the principles of it. I hope that was useful, and if you did find that useful, then please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.